Hey there. Javier Milei has really made a splash since sweeping to power as Argentina's president. He's famous for waving a chainsaw about to highlight his opposition to government spending. And Milei's libertarian agenda has clearly won him lots of friends around the world, none more powerful than US President Donald Trump. So when the peso came under huge pressure this fall, Trump's treasury did something remarkable. It stepped in, buying pesos and promising billions of dollars in support. That was a big deal for Milei, because he has Argentina in what's called a currency band to help fight inflation. And without US support, Milei might have had to abandon that band and let the peso drop dramatically. But what exactly is a currency band? What's the US promising? And what does it all mean for Argentina's economy and the US taxpayer? Let's try and find out. I'm Carmel Crimmins, and this is Reuters Econ World. Every week we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So on this week's show, the currency lifeline. So to discuss all things currency, I'm delighted today to have Karin Strohecker, our Chief Emerging Markets Correspondent into Econ World. Karin, hello. How are you?
Hi, Carmel. I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Can we get straight into the nerdiness, straight into the wonk? What is a currency band, Karin, and how do they work?
So a currency band is when a government, a central bank, would like to keep its currency in a certain range with regards to other currencies or other singular currency, maybe against the US dollar, for example. And there's somewhere in the middle, there's various FX regimes. You can have like a floating rate, which is like total free float that is dominated by market forces, determined by market forces. And you can have a peg, which is on the other end, which means there's, a currency is pegged at a certain level to another currency, usually a big one like the euro or the dollar or something like that. And currency bands are somewhere in the middle, right? They help governments to keep the currency sort of in a corridor, but give a little bit of leeway to move either side of it.
And how do they actually do that? How do they keep the currency in that band?
So there's a few ways in which central banks and policymakers can do that. The most obvious one is direct intervention, right? If you see that your currency is weakening, you could just go to the market and buy it, create artificial demand, take some of your FX reserves, your hard currency, sell that on the market, buy your own currency. That will make it strengthen. Or if you see it's getting too strong, vice versa, right? Sell it on the market. But there's also, of course, other levers as well, like you have interest rates, for example. So if you raise your interest rates, automatically investors are keen to go into your markets and buy your debt because they're going to get a higher interest rate. They're going to get paid more to hold your debt, for example. And that will create inflows that create a demand that will prop up the currency and help it strengthen.
Right. Why would a government do this in the first place? Why wouldn't they just let the market decide what value the currency has?
There's a few ways of thinking about that. One is that it's much easier if a currency is stable, right? If you as a government, you have to pay for your imports, or if you're a country that exports, or your country, that has a lot of producers that import and then export, if they don't know what the currency is going to be like within certain levels, it will make their planning and their trading and their commerce very, very difficult, right? So this is just for planning purposes. Having a stable currency is generally seen as a good thing. As a policymaker, if your currency weakens a lot, that will make often imports a lot more expensive. So you can generate inflation, which is, exponential and running on its own. So you want to be careful about that as well. So helping your currency, stabilizing your currency is something that is very much desired.
So what you're saying, Karin, like with these currency controls, with currency bans, in theory, it sounds like a good idea. You're giving people certainty, investors, exporters, importers, certainty about where a currency's level is. But they've fallen out of favor, haven't they?
Yes, they have. I guess one big issue with currency bans and also currency pegs is that you really need to have a lot of firepower to make sure you can hold them. Because if they start unraveling, if they start going, they go in a really spectacular way. And the crash is then much, much more dramatic than anything else you might see. We really saw that in the Asian financial crisis. There was a time in the 90s, early 90s, when economies like Thailand, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia were running red hot. Mm-hmm. All the investors piled in there. They bought stocks, they bought real estate. Currency was really quite stable and gave an illusion of stability that was possibly not there. Because at the same time, a country like Thailand, for example, had huge deficits and they actually did not have the reserves to defend the currency if any sort of pressure would come. And as investors started to think a little bit more about those vulnerabilities and were a bit cautious, it started to unravel really, really quickly. It forced the Bank of Thailand to spend billions in trying to prop up their currency. Eventually, they lost that battle. They had to unpeg. They were pegged to the US dollar. They had to unpeg. The currency in the wake of that fell 50% in the months thereafter. And that has all the painful effects that you can imagine. Like there was a huge amount of corporate bankruptcies. A lot of them had borrowed short-term. A lot of companies had borrowed short-term. US dollar debt, couldn't pay back, went bankrupt. The country had a really severe recession. And that was just one of the blocks in Asia, right? And after that, these sort of currency pegs and very rigid structures to keep your currency very closely linked to a certain level fell very much out of favor. Policymakers now want to let them adjust to the macroeconomic backdrop to make sure that there's a natural level that the currency can find where possible.
Okay, quiz time. Argentina's economy has been going through a bit of a rough patch, but it wasn't so long ago that Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries on earth. In fact, at the turn of the 20th century, some data suggests Argentina was wealthier per capita than Germany, with a gleaming capital city to rival any major European city. So what nickname was often used to describe Buenos Aires during Argentina's economic peak in the early 1900s? Was it A, the Venice of the Americas, B, the Paris of the South, or C, the Prague of the Pampas? We'll have the answer for you at the end of the show. Up next, we take a deeper look at Milei's economic agenda. So Karin, talk to us about Argentina. So President Milei swept to power at the end of 2023. What sort of economy did he inherit?
The economy at the time in Argentina was really, really in dire straits. Like we had inflation that was well above 200%, which is massive, which is hyperinflation. We had an economy that had gone through various boom and bust cycles. The busts were big, the booms were quite small and weak. So when we look at average growth that they had over the past decade or a little bit beyond, we're like at just around 1%, which is really no growth. A stagnating economy, hyperinflation, super high government spending, and they were printing money, which fueled inflation, right? So that didn't really work very well. And Milei and his chainsaw, he pledged to change all of that.
So how's he done, right? Because he's prioritised cutting government spending, so moving the fiscal situation into balance, into a surplus, and also bringing down inflation. So how's he doing on those?
So he's definitely following through on his promises or part of them. There's still a little way to go, but he has cut spending dramatically. This has been like, a country that was where transport, utilities was heavily subsidized. And a lot of these subsidies now have gone away. He has stopped the money printing. He has brought inflation, I'd say, under control. Inflation came down to somewhere close to 30% on an annual level. Whilst it's come down dramatically, it needs to come down more. And the second bit going forward is going to be much harder. And I guess there's also a way to think about it, how it affected the population, right? Especially these huge, huge cuts that we have seen in spending. When Milei came in, around 40% of Argentines were living at the poverty line or below. Now that number, just in the first half of 2024, after he came in, rose to more than 50%. So especially pensioners, vulnerable groups of society were hugely affected. Like we see pictures of, soup kitchens being in higher demand than what they can ever cater for. The toll, the pain this has exerted on the population is quite dramatic. Milei would say that's, the tough medicine that is needed. Can he sustain that level of spending cuts over the longer term? That needs to be seen because, a population doesn't like to suffer like that either.
And the battle against inflation, the exchange rate ban is a key part of that, isn't it?
Yes, because Argentina is relying very heavily on its exports and on its imports. And so having a stable currency and having people not dollarizing and having only one exchange rate is really an integral part of managing your inflation and managing inflation expectations, right? If you don't know what the exchange rate is going to be and you live in Argentina and you don't trust it and you think the peso could be tumbling again, you're going to try and get dollars. You don't trust your local currency. So he needs to establish trust. He needs to make sure that inflation expectations, which inform, what you purchase, how you decide on your spending, that all of this is on a much calmer and more settled trajectory than it was in recent decades.
I mean, it is kind of ironic, isn't it? I mean, Milei comes very much from a free market perspective, the libertarian perspective, but he's relying on this band to help keep inflation down, to help kind of instill certainty in the Argentine economy. I mean, when he first came to power, there was talk about potentially replacing the Argentinian peso right altogether and using the US dollar. Has that gone away?
Yes, he was even talking about how the peso isn't even worth excrement.
Wow.
Talking about how
he's not talking it up.
Toilet paper. Oh no, he certainly didn't talk it up. And one of his key campaign pledges was actually get rid of the central bank, get rid of the peso. Now, I don't think there was really much appetite for that. And if you decide as a country to convert your currency into the US dollar, you actually need to have the US dollars to do this, right? And when he took over, the FX reserves were empty. There was nothing in the coffers. So he didn't have the technical means to actually do it. At the same time, I don't think there was much appetite to actually get rid of your central bank, especially, we have some smaller economies around the world that don't have their own central banks because they're so attached to bigger countries. But in general, Argentina is a sizable economy. They should be able to determine their own monetary policy. Getting rid of this institution, there was no appetite for it internally. There was no appetite really for it externally.
Okay, I've got some big news to share, especially for our American listeners. On December 3rd and 4th, I'll be in New York City for Reuters Next, our flagship live journalism event. The Reuters team of journalists will be speaking with some of the most important people moving markets. Think global policymakers, tech innovators, and business leaders. As for me, I'll be hosting a panel all about Trump's economy. You can sign up to watch the live stream or join me in person by clicking the link in the show notes. You won't want to miss it. Up next, Karin and I discuss why the US decided to intervene in Argentina's currency market. So markets recently got spooked at the idea that maybe Milei wouldn't be able to push through his economic reforms. He and his party didn't do so well in local elections.